why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times, and more. Hello, dear listener, and welcome to our tale of why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times and more. Tonight, we will wander together through the damp, mist-shrouded lanes of a forgotten village, through the towering, shadowed halls of a stone keep, and across fields that have known nothing but toil and the turning of seasons. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calming bedtime stories, don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe, so you never miss another whisper in the night. Now, let us step into the long, lingering twilight of the 14th century, where the chill of the stone seeps into your bones, where the scent of wood smoke and soil is the only perfume the world knows, and where the silence is so profound you can hear the weight of history breathing in the dark. Consider, for a moment, the sheer, unyielding weight of a single day. Not our day, with its electric hum and its fleeting digital distractions, but a day carved from the very elements. A day that begins not with an alarm, but with the distant, plaintive crow of a rooster fighting the gloom, and ends not with the blue glow of a screen, but with the utter, suffocating blackness of a world without a moon. This is not a story of kings and queens, of glorious battles and shining armor. Those are tales for the daylight. This is a story of the spaces between. It is the story of the mud on the road, the ache in the back, the whisper of fear in the dark, the fragile warmth of a single candle against a universe of cold. It is the story of a world where every breath is a negotiation with the earth, every moment a silent prayer against the vast, indifferent dark. We are about to slip into the worn leather shoes of another, to feel the world through senses long since dulled by our own comfort. This is not a test of strength, but of spirit. For the greatest challenge of that age was not the sword or the plague, but the relentless, grinding press of obscurity. The haunting question of whether your existence would leave any mark upon the world at all, or if you would simply vanish like a footprint in the rain. So let us drift back to a place where the night is not empty, but full. Chapter 1. The Ache of Dawn. The dark was not silent. It was a tapestry of sound, woven thick and close in the absolute black. The scuttle of a beetle across the earthen floor was a journey of epic proportions. The sigh of the wind through the ill-fitting shutters was a mournful chorus. And beneath it all, the deep rhythmic breathing of the sleepers, a low hum of life in a world held in suspension. Elara did not wake to light, for there was none. She woke to the cold. It was a cold that lived in the walls of the wattle and daub cottage, a cold that seeped up from the ground and pressed down from the moss-thatched roof. It was a presence. It had crept under the thin woolen blanket she shared with her younger brother Finn, and had settled deep into her joints. She was 13 winters old, and her bones already held the memory of every frost. Her eyes opened to the same nothingness they saw when closed. The fire in the central hearth had died hours ago, leaving only the ghost of warmth and the faint, acrid scent of old ash. She listened. Her father's breath, from the pallet on the far side of the single room, was a ragged sawing sound. Her mother's was softer, punctuated by a tiny, wheezing whistle. Finn, curled against her back for warmth, was still lost in the simple peace of sleep. This was the first truth of the day, the relentless, inescapable cold. It was a truth you would have to make your peace with the moment consciousness returned. There was no central heating to click on, no hot shower to step into. The cold was a part of you, and you a part of it. With a sigh that misted in the air before her face, Alara slipped from the bed. The packed earth floor was frigid against her bare feet. She moved by memory through the absolute dark, her hands outstretched, finding the rough-hewn table, the stool, the cool clay of the water jug. Her fingers traced the familiar chips and grooves. This was her world, mapped not by sight, but by touch. Her second task was the fire. Kneeling before the hearth, she brushed away the cold ashes from the previous night, her hands becoming smudged with gray. From a small leather pouch, she took last autumn's dried moss and a precious sliver of flint. The strike, in the profound quiet of the pre-dawn, was a shock of sound, a tiny, furious star of light that sparked and died. Again and again. A fourth strike caught the moss, a glowing ember born from nothing. She cupped it gently, breathing on it, a soft, life-giving whisper. She fed it slivers of dried birch bark, then the smallest, most precious twigs. A flame, hesitant and golden, began to lick upwards. The light it cast was not the brilliant, even glare of a modern bulb. It was a living thing, a dancing, trembling globe of illumination that pushed back the shadows just a few feet, making them deeper and more mysterious beyond its reach. It painted the walls in pulses of orange and gold, revealing the smoky sheen of the rafters, the humble tools hanging from pegs, the sleeping forms of her family. It was a fragile victory. This was the second truth. Light was life, and it was hard won. It was a daily ritual of creation, a tiny defiance against the dark. You would not simply flick a switch. You would plead for it, nurture it, and guard it jealously. By the time the first sliver of gray light began to bleed through the shutters, the small iron pot was hanging over the fire, containing a thin gruel of oats and barley, the water drawn from the rain barrel outside the door. The room was now filled with the smells of wood smoke and cooking, a humble, earthy perfume. The sounds of waking began her father's groaning stretch, her mother's soft cough, Finn's sleepy mumbling. They ate in silence from wooden bowls with wooden spoons. The gruel was bland, sustenance, not pleasure. It would fill the belly for a few hours, nothing more. There was no coffee, no tea, and no sugar, no variety. This was the third truth. Hunger was a constant companion, and food was fuel, rarely joy. The memory of a summer berry or a taste of wild honey was a treasure to be hoarded in the mind for months like these. As the weak, watery light of a late winter morning finally strengthened, Alara pulled on her outer clothes, a coarse woolen tunic over her shift, and a hooded mantle of thicker, greasy wool. She tied her leather shoes, solace worn thin. Her father, Alaric, was already pulling on his boots, his face a mask of grim endurance. He was 40 years old, but life had carved him into a man of 60. His back was permanently stooped from labor, his hands a roadmap of scars and calluses. "The East Field?" he said, his voice a low rumble. That was all. There was no discussion. The day's work was dictated by the season, the weather, and the Lord's demands. There was no calling in sick, no weekend, and no vacation. The fourth truth: your life was not your own. Your time, your labor, your body belonged to the land, to the season, and to the Lord in his stone manor on the hill. Alara followed him out into the world. The air was a physical blow, damp and cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke from other cottages, of frost, of wet earth, and the ever-present, pungent smell of the madden heap at the end of the lane. The village of Oak Haven was a collection of perhaps 20 such cottages, crouched together along a muddy track as if for warmth. Beyond lay the fields, strips of brown and faded green divided by balks of grass, and beyond that, the dark, brooding wall of the forest. And the silence, it was a thing of weight and texture. No distant hum of traffic, no drone of aeroplanes, no electronic buzz. Just the caw of a crow, the lowing of a cow from the common pasture, the whisper of the wind through bare branches. It was a silence that could swallow you whole. You would have to learn to live inside it, to hear your own thoughts as deafeningly loud in the immense quiet of the world. Alara's breeze plumed before her as she walked to the small fenced garden plot behind their cottage. Her mother, Lyra, was already there, her hands red with cold as she checked the protective straw covering the winter vegetables. Her movements were economical, precise. Every ounce of energy was precious and not to be wasted. "The leeks are holding," her mother said, not looking up, "but the frost is deep. We need more straw." Alara nodded, though her mother couldn't see. This was the fifth truth. There was no safety net. A deep frost, a blight, a hungry rabbit. Any small thing could mean the difference between survival and starvation come spring. Your entire existence was a precarious balancing act on the edge of a cliff. The day unspooled in a rhythm of unceasing labor. There was water to be fetched from the well, a journey made twice a day, the heavy bucket straining her arm. There was wool to be carded for spinning, the repetitive motion making her shoulders ache. There was the endless mending, her eyes straining in the dim light to repair a tear in her father's tunic with a bone needle and rough thread. And through it all, the cold, the perpetual, grinding cold. It was in her fingers, making them clumsy. It was in her nose and ears. It was a central fact of being. You would not escape it. You would simply learn to carry it with you, a chill core at the center of your being. As dusk began to bleed the color from the world, the family gathered once more around the hearth. The fire was the heart of the home, the only source of light and warmth. They ate a stew of beans and a few scraps of salted pork, a rare luxury. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the scraping of spoons. There was no conversation about the events of the day, no news of the world. The world was Oak Haven. The news was the weather, the state of the crops, the health of the pig. The Lord's tax collector was due soon. That was the extent of it. This was the sixth truth, perhaps the most profound, the sheer, unimaginable mental solitude. There were no books, no newspapers, and no way to know what was happening beyond the next village. Your mind's landscape was as small and as bounded as the physical one. Your worries were immediate, your joys simple and fleeting. The vast, interconnected world we know simply did not exist. You were alone with your thoughts in the long, dark silence. Finn, bored, asked their mother to tell a story. Lyra smiled, a rare softening of her worn features in the firelight. She began to speak of the Green Man, a spirit of the forest, who slept in the winter but would awaken in the spring to make the leaves grow. It was a story told for generations, its words as familiar and comforting as the stones of the hearth. This was their history, their science, their entertainment. Not facts and figures, but myth and folklore, whispered from one generation to the next around a dying fire. It was a way of explaining a world that was terrifyingly mysterious. You would not have Wikipedia. You would have stories, and you would have to choose whether to believe them. Alara listened, but her eyes were drawn to the single small window, a pane of greased linen stretched tight. It was utterly black outside. The dark was complete, absolute. It was not merely an absence of light. It was a presence, a velvet cloth thrown over the world, and in that dark, anything could be lurking. Wolves, bandits, or things for older and far less tangible. The seventh truth. The night was a time of genuine fear. The dark held real, unknown terrors. There was no street lamp to push them back, no phone to call for help. You were on your own, behind a door that was little more than wood and hope. Later, as the embers died down to a deep red glow, the family retired to their beds. The cold intensified without the fire's defiance. Alara lay next to Finn, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin, shivering until the small space around her began to warm minutely from her own body heat. She stared into the darkness above, listening to the wind moan in the thatch. She thought of the stories of the Green Man. She thought of the endless, aching labor of the day. She thought of the Lord in his manor, who she had seen only once, a distant figure on a horse. Her life was a tiny, flickering candle in an immense, dark room. The thought was not self-pitying. It was simply a fact, as true as the cold or the hunger. This was the ache of dawn, not just in the muscles, but in the soul. A constant, low-grade hum of exhaustion, of vulnerability, of knowing precisely how fragile your hold on the world truly was. And as she finally drifted into a sleep that was as much a respite as it was a surrender to the cold, the first fat flakes of a new snow began to fall silently on Oak Haven, covering the mud, the thatch, the maddened heap, and the world in a blanket of pristine, indifferent white. Chapter 2. The Lord's Shadow. The snow fell for 2 days, sealing the village in a silent white tomb. The world shrank further, reduced to the distance between cottage and barn. The path to the well-trodden into a slippery trench of mud and ice. Sound was muffled, absorbed by the thick falling flakes, until the only thing left was the thump of your own heart in your ears and the crunch of your own footsteps, a profound isolation that would gnaw at the mind of anyone accustomed to constant noise and connection. On the third morning, A different sound cut through the muffled silence. The jingle of harness and the slow, heavy tread of a horse on the frozen track. It was a sound that carried authority and fear. Alara was outside, breaking the ice on the water barrel with a stone, her hands aching with a cold so sharp it felt like burning. She looked up, and her breath caught. A rider, draped in a thick woolen cloak, his face shadowed by a hood, sat atop a large destrier. Behind him, on foot, came 2 men-at-arms, their spears resting on their shoulders, and a thinner man in a dark robe, carrying a wax tablet and a quill. The Lord's steward, the tax collector. He did not look at her. His eyes scanned the village with a look of weary disdain, as if surveying a particularly poorly maintained barn. He reined his horse to a stop before the door of Goodrich, the village reeve. The procession had arrived. A low dread, colder than the ice on the barrow, seeped through the village. Doors, which had been open a crack to let out smoke, were pulled shut. Children were called inside. The normal, scant sounds of life, the chop of wood, the chatter of women ceased entirely. An unnatural quiet descended, broken only by the snort of the horse and the steward's voice, a dry, rasping thing as he spoke to Goodrich. This was the 8th truth, the ever-present shadow of hierarchy. Your life was not only one of physical hardship, but of powerlessness. The man on the horse owned the land you walked on, the cottage you slept in, the tools you used. He could demand your labor, your crops, and your son for his army. His word was law, and his justice was swift and brutal. There were no rights, no appeals, and no court of public opinion. You were at the bottom, and the weight of the entire structure pressed down upon you. Alara hurried inside, her heart thumping. Her father was already standing, his face grim. Her mother had stopped her spinning, her hands frozen in midair. "They are at Goodrich's," Alara whispered, though there was no need to whisper. Alaric nodded once, a sharp, tense movement. He went to a small, hidden niche in the wall and pulled out a cloth pouch. Alara heard the faint, dull clink of coins, their entire savings. Money painstakingly set aside from the sale of a piglet, from the extra wool her mother had spun. It was meant for a new plowshare, for salt, for a time of sickness. Now, it would go to the man on the horse. The 9th truth, the relentless extraction. You worked from dawn to dusk, and a significant portion of everything you produced grain. Livestock, labor, coin was taken from you. It was not a debate. It was not a tax return filed in April. It was a man arriving at your door, assessing what you had, and taking what he decided was owed. And there was nothing you could do but hand it over and hope it was enough. They waited. The silence in the cottage was heavier than the silence outside. It was filled with the unspoken anxiety of every family in Oak Haven. Had they produced enough? Would the steward be in a foul mood? Would he take the last of the salted meat? The threat of violence was never spoken, but it hung in the air, as palpable as the cold. The men-at-arms were not there for decoration. After what felt like an age, there was a rap at the door, not a friendly knock, but a sharp, percussive command. Alaric opened it. The steward stood there, his robe dusted with snow. He did not step inside. He looked past Alaric, his eyes scanning the single room in one swift, comprehensive glance. He took in the hearth, the beds, the tools, and the pot over the fire. His expression did not change. It was the look of a man inventorying livestock. Alaric of the Eastfield Strip, the thin man with the tablet said, his voice monotone. He consulted his notes. Harvest: 6 bushels of barley, 3 of wheat. 1 pig slaughtered Martinmas. 1 hen, wife spinning, 2 ells of cloth. He looked up. The Lord's due is 1/3 of grain, 1 flank of the pig, the hen, and the cloth. Alara felt a sickness in her stomach. The hen? They had only 1 left. It provided a few precious eggs, their only reliable source of protein. To lose it was a catastrophe. Alaric's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. He did not argue. Arguing was not only futile, it was dangerous. He simply held out the cloth pouch of coins. "Sir," he said, his voice rough, "a payment. For the hen, to keep it for the eggs, for my boy." The steward took the pouch, weighed in his hand for a moment, his expression unchanging. He poured the coins into his palm, counted them with a flick of his eyes, and then dropped them back into the pouch, tucking it into his robe. "The hen stays," he said, as if commenting on the weather. He made a mark on his wax tablet. "The cloth and the pig's flank by week's end. The grain has already been taken from the manor store." And with that, he turned and moved to the next cottage. The transaction was over. There was no receipt, no thank you, and no acknowledgement of the immense value of what he had just taken. It was simply the way of the world. Alaric closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, his eyes closed. He looked exhausted, aged. They had kept the hen, but they had lost their savings. They had traded one form of security for another. It was a calculation made from a position of no good options. Lyra let out a long, slow breath she seemed to have been holding for minutes. She went back to her spinning, her movements tighter, more furious. Alara understood. This was the reality. Your survival was a series of these desperate bargains, these small, bitter losses. You celebrated not gains, but the mitigation of disaster. You had not won. You had merely lost a little less than you feared. That afternoon, the steward and his men were gone as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving a trail of anxiety and resentment in their wake. The village did not breathe a sigh of relief. Instead, a new kind of work began. Women gathered what had been demanded: a ham, a sack of grain, a bundle of cloth to be taken up to the manor. The mood was somber, funereal. Alara was sent to Goodrich's cottage with their portion of the salted pig's flank. She carried the precious, heavy bundle wrapped in cloth, feeling its loss with every step. At the Reeves' door, she found others from the village doing the same. They did not speak to each other. Their eyes were downcast. There was a shared shame in this ritual of surrender. As she walked back, she looked up the hill, through the skeletal trees, to where the manor house stood. It was not a grand castle, but a sturdy stone hall with a wooden palisade. a place of real power in their world. Smoke rose from its chimneys, a great deal of smoke, suggesting vast hearths and endless fuel. She imagined them in there, the Lord and his family, warm, well-fed, perhaps listening to a minstrel, unaware of the specific loss of one hen in one family in the village below. To them, Oak Haven was not a collection of people, but a source of revenue, a number on the ledger, the 10th truth, the crushing weight of injustice. There was no recourse, no way to say, this isn't fair. The system was not designed to be fair. It was designed to be. The divide between the powerful and the powerless was as deep and uncrossable as the ocean, and would breed in you a quiet, simmering resentment that you could never, ever act upon. It would become a part of you, a second heart beating with a rhythm of bitterness and acceptance. That night, the atmosphere in the cottage was heavier. The fire seemed to give less warmth. The gruel tasted of absence. The world felt smaller, poorer, and darker. But as Alara lay in bed, listening to the wind, a new thought came to her, a tiny spark in the gloom. The steward had looked at their home, their life, and seen only assets to be counted. He had not seen her mother's skill at spinning, the evenness of her stitches. He had not seen her father's knowledge of the soil, which strip would yield the best barley. He had not seen the story her mother told, the way it made Finn's eyes light up. He had seen what could be taken, but he was blind to what truly mattered. They had their health, for now. They had each other. They had the ember of the fire and the stories in the dark. It was a fragile defiance, a whisper in the face of a gale. But it was hers. And in a world where everything tangible could be taken from you, the things that were unseen, love, knowledge, spirit, became your most fiercely guarded treasures. You would have to learn to find your victories not in acquisition, but in preservation. Not in rising, but in not breaking. And outside, the snow began to fall again, gently, endlessly, blurring the tracks of the steward's horse, covering the marks of his passage, as if the world itself was trying to forget. Chapter 3. The Silence of the Forest. The deep cold held Oak Haven in its grip for a week more, a week of short gray days and long black nights. The meager stores, already diminished by the Lord's tax, began to press on everyone's mind with a new, sharp urgency. The hunger, usually a background hum, became a conscious thought. It was this need that drove Alaric into the forest on a morning when the sky was the color of lead and the air was so still and cold it felt brittle. The forest was not a place of recreation. It was a place of peril and provision. It was the Lord's forest, by law, and hunting his game was a crime punishable by hanging or the loss of a hand. But the ancient rite of pannage, of foraging for fallen branches, for nuts, for fungi, for anything that might supplement a starving diet, was a risk that had to be taken. "Alara," her father said, pulling on his thickest mittens. "With me." It was not a request. Her small hands were better for gathering, her eyes sharper for spotting the pale bloom of a mushroom on a rotten log. And there was safety, of a sort, in two. The forest was vast and old. It was easy to become lost in its green, tangled heart, where the light fell in broken pieces and the paths were made by deer, not men. This was the 11th truth. The natural world was not a park. It was an active, threatening, and a moral participant in your life. It could provide sustenance, but it could also kill you with a fallen branch, a hidden wolf trap, a misstep into an icy stream. You did not venture into it lightly. You went with purpose, with fear, and with respect. Alara followed her father, the village soon disappearing behind them as they passed the first sentinel-like trees. The world changed instantly. The wind, which had been biting on the open field, was gone, blocked by the thick trunks of oaks and ashes that had stood for centuries. The silence here was different from the village silence. It was a listening silence. It was full of the drip of melting snow from branches, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the creak of ancient boughs. The air smelled of damp rot, of pine, of cold stone. The path was a narrow, muddy track, barely visible. Alaric moved with a quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the ground, the trees, and the way ahead. He was a part of this world in a way that Alara knew she was not. He could read the signs, the scratch of a boar on a tree, the feather of an owl caught on a thorn. They did not speak. Words felt like a violation here. This was the 12th truth. Your connection to nature was one of primal literacy. You learned to read the sky for weather, the tracks for game, the plants for medicine and poison. Your life depended on this knowledge, passed down through generations, not from books, but from demonstration and warning. A mistake could be fatal. Eating the wrong berry, misidentifying a wolf's print for a dog's. These were not errors of trivia, but of survival. For an hour, they worked. Alara's fingers, even in her mittens, grew numb as she dug through the snow and leaf litter for acorns, stuffing them into the sack she carried. They found a cluster of tough, wintry fungi growing on a north-facing log. It was not a feast, but it was something. A handful of calories, a promise of a slightly thicker gruel. As they moved deeper, the forest grew darker. The canopy thickened, holding the permanent twilight of winter. Alara's sense of direction began to blur. Every tree looked the same. Every clearing felt familiar and foreign at once. She stayed close to her father's back, his steady, silent presence her only tether to the world she knew. And then, he stopped. He held up a hand, a sharp, silent command. She froze, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. He was staring into a thicket of holly, his body tense. Alara followed his gaze. For a long moment, she saw nothing but the deep green of the leaves and the shadows between them. Then, a shadow moved. It resolved into a shape, a pair of eyes reflecting the dim light. Low to the ground, unblinking, a wolf. It was lean, its gray fur matted, its ribs visible even from a distance. Winter was hard on all creatures. This was not the monster of folklore, but something more terrifying in its reality. A hungry predator, and they were in its territory. The 13th truth. The threat of death was immediate and physical. It was not an abstract concept discussed in a news report from a far-off land. It was here, in the glint of an eye in the shadows. It was in the ache of a tooth that could become a fatal infection. It was in a simple cut that could turn septic. Your mortality was your constant companion, and it wore the face of a hungry wolf, a fall on the ice, a fever in the night. Time seemed to stretch, thin and taut. Alara did not breathe. Her father did not move. His hand slowly, ever so slowly, moved to the wood axe tucked into his belt. It was a tool, not a weapon. Against a wolf, it was a pathetic defense. But it was all he had. The wolf stared. They stared back. It was a silent conversation of need and fear. The wolf's need for food, their fear of becoming it. Alara felt a terror so pure it was like a cold clarity. She thought of her mother, of Finn, of the warm hearth. She thought of the stories. Was this how it ended? A whisper in the forest, a brief struggle, and then nothing? The sheer randomness of it was paralyzing. One decision to come to this part of the forest on this day had led to this moment. There was no reason, no fairness. Only hunger on both sides of the holly thicket. And then a distant sound echoed through the trees. The deep, resonant blast of a hunting horn. It was coming from the direction of the manor. The Lord's hunt was abroad. The wolf's ears twitched. It turned its head, distracted for a crucial second by this new, louder danger. In that moment, Alaric moved. He did not run. He took a single, deliberate step forward, away from Alara, and brought the axe down with a thunderous crack on the exposed root of a nearby oak. The sound was enormous, a gunshot in the silence. It shattered the tension. The wolf, startled, flinched back. It looked from the man to the source of the horn, its instinct for self-preservation warring with its hunger. With a low, almost inaudible growl, it turned and melted back into the shadows, gone as suddenly as it had appeared. Alaric stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, and the axe still in his hand. He looked back at Alara, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear he would never give voice to. He gave a single, sharp nod. The message was clear. The foraging was over. They did not run. Running would invite pursuit. They walked, their backs prickling with the feeling of being watched. But Alaric's pace was swift and deliberate. He led them out by a different, quicker route, his knowledge of the wood now a lifeline. When they finally broke through the tree line and saw the smoke of Oak Haven rising in the still air, a wave of relief so physical it made Alara's knees weak washed over her. The familiar mud of the track, the sound of a crying baby from a cottage, the smell of the madden, all of it was beautiful. It was safety. It was home. They did not speak of the wolf to Lyra. It would only cause her worry. The incident was folded into the silent catalog of daily risks, a story that would remain untold. But it lived in Alara's eyes. That night, as she lay in bed, she did not see the darkness of the cottage. She saw the darkness between the holly leaves and the 2 points of light staring back. The 14th truth. Trauma was not processed. It was absorbed. There were no therapists, no debriefings. The terrifying, the brutal, the unjust, you swallowed it. You buried it deep inside, letting it become another stone in the foundation of your being. You hardened around it, or you broke. Most people hardened. It was the only way to last. The encounter in the forest changed something in her. It peeled back a layer of the world and showed her the raw, toothy reality beneath the stories. The Green Man was a comforting tale for by the fire, but the forest itself was ruled by a simpler, starker law: eat or be eaten. Yet, as the days passed, the memory of the fear began to be intertwined with another memory: the sight of her father, standing between her and the danger, his body a shield. The sound of the axe hitting the root, not in attack, but in defense. A creation of sound to ward off silence. An act of courage not to conquer, but to protect. It was a different kind of story. One not of myths, but of choices. In the face of a vast, uncaring, and dangerous world, people still stood for each other. They foraged for acorns to fill a child's belly. They faced down wolves with tools. They swallowed their fear to keep peace in the home. The forest was silent and terrifying, but it had also shown her that the will to live, to protect one's own, was a force as ancient and as powerful as any winter. It was a quiet fire banked within the human spirit, and it could not be so easily extinguished. Chapter 4. The Flicker of the Hearth. Winter, as it always does, began to lose its grip. It was a slow, grudging surrender. The snows turned to rain, a cold, dreary drizzle that turned the village track into a river of churned mud. The days grew imperceptibly longer, the light lingering a few precious minutes more each evening, a pale gold wash against the gray sky. But this was the most dangerous time. The stores were at their lowest. The hungry gap before the spring planting could yield anything was a yawning chasm. The cold and wet bred sickness. Hope was a fragile thing, worn thin by the long months of dark. The cough started with Finn. It was a small, dry thing at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the rain on the thatch. But within a day, it had deepened, becoming a ragged, wrenching sound that shook his small frame. His face grew flushed, his eyes overly bright. Lyra's mouth set into a tight line. She moved him closer to the fire, wrapping him in every blanket they had. She prepared a tisane of dried thyme and precious honey, coaxing him to sip it. Her movements were calm, but Alara could see the fear in her eyes, a reflection of the fear they had all felt in the forest. This was the fifth nth truth. Medicine was folk magic and desperate hope. There were no doctors, no antibiotics, and no clinics. Illness was a voyage into terrifying uncertainty. A simple chest infection could become pneumonia. A child's fever could burn out his life in a single night. Your arsenal was made of herbs, poultices, prayers, and old wives' tales. You fought death with whispers and willow bark, and you lost as often as you won. Alaric could only watch, his hands clasped, his face a mask of helplessness. His strength, which could face down a wolf, was useless against this invisible enemy. Alara took over Finn's chores, the work doubling. The fetching of water, the mending, and the endless battle against the mud that wanted to reclaim the cottage floor. The world narrowed to the sound of her brother's coughing and the hiss of the rain. One afternoon, as the light was failing, Goodrich's wife, Agnes, came to the door. She was a stout woman with a kind, weary face. She did not come inside for fear of the sickness, but handed Lyra a small earthenware pot through the door. "Goose fat," she said, her voice low. "Rub it on his chest, and this." She held out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Lyra opened it to reveal a dried, twisted root. Mandrake, a piece under his bed. "For the fever." Lyra nodded, her throat too tight for words. The gratitude in her eyes was immense. This was the 16th truth. Community was your only shield. In the absence of institutions, of hospitals, of social safety nets, you relied on your neighbors. They were your network, your support. Their survival was tied to yours. A gift of goose fat or a sliver of precious mandrake root was not charity. It was an investment in the collective survival of Oak Haven. You helped others, because one day you would need help yourself. The gesture, small as it was, seemed to break the spell of isolation. Later that evening, Old Man Hemming, who was said had the second sight, left a charm of woven rowan twigs hanging on their door latch. Another neighbor left a bowl of turnip soup on the doorstep. They were not alone. The village, for all its poverty and hardship, was a single organism. When one part sickened, the others felt it, and rallied in their own small, superstitious, heartfelt ways. Lyra used the goose fat, massaging it into Finn's thin chest. She placed a piece of mandrake root under his palate. She continued with the tisanes. She sat with him through the night, her hand on his forehead, whispering prayers that were a mixture of half-remembered Latin from the traveling priest and older, pagan words passed down from her grandmother. Elara watched her mother. In the flickering light of the single candle, Lyra seemed to be made of the same stuff as the stories she told, ancient, enduring, and powerful. This was her battleground. Not the field or the forest, but this small space between the hearth and the bed. Her weapons were knowledge, patience, and a love as tough and resilient as oak. This was the 17th truth, the immense, often invisible strength of women. Theirs was a domain of relentless, crucial labor, the management of scarce resources, the nursing of the sick, the birthing of children, the weaving of cloth, the tending of the home fire. Their power was not recorded in chronicles, but it was the very glue that held this fragile world together. It was a power of endurance, of nurture, of quiet, world-sustaining force. For 3 days, the household lived in a state of suspended animation. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the rhythm of Finn's breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the silent, watchful vigil. And then, on the 4th morning, the rain stopped. A weak, watery sun broke through the clouds, and Finn's fever broke with it. The flush left his cheeks, and his breathing, while still ragged, lost the terrifying, desperate edge. He slept, a true sleep, not a fevered stupor. The relief was so profound it was dizzying. Lyra slumped onto a stool, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Alaric put a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes bright. He went outside, and Alara heard the solid, repetitive think of him chopping wood with a furious, grateful energy. The crisis had passed. They had weathered it together. That evening, for the first time in days, there was a sense of peace. Finn was propped up by the fire, sipping broth. The air in the cottage, once thick with fear, felt lighter. The setting sun sent a beam of light through the open door, illuminating the motes of dust and smoke dancing in the air. Lyra began to tell a story. Not of the Green Man, but an older story, one Alara had not heard before. Long ago, she began, her voice soft and hoarse from weariness. When the world was all forest and the sky was closer, the first people shivered in the dark. They had no fire. They ate their meat raw and were cold always. They begged the sun for a piece of his light, but he was too high and proud to listen. They asked the stars, but they were too cold and distant. Finn's eyes were fixed on her, wide and listening. So they asked the earth, Lyra continued. And deep in her heart, where the roots of the mountains grow, she held a secret warmth. She took pity on them. She told them of a stone that was not a stone, a tree that was not a tree, that held a sleeping spark within. It was the flint and the tinder fungus. She taught them that to get the spark, you had to strike with need and with respect. And so the first fire was born. It was small and it was fragile. The wind wanted to blow it out. The rain wanted to drown it. But they cupped their hands around it. They fed it with tiny sticks. They told it stories. They shared its warmth. And because they cherished it, it grew strong. She looked around at her family, her gaze resting on each of them in the firelight. That spark was never just for warmth. It was the first story. It was the first medicine. It was the first community. It is what we do when the world is dark and cold. We strike the stone. We nurture the spark. We share it. We protect it. And we pass it on. Alara understood. The story wasn't about fire. It was about them. It was about her father's axe striking the root in the forest. It was about her mother's vigil over a sick child. It was about Anna's goose fat and Hemming's rowan charm. It was the unbreakable will to create a little light, a little warmth against the immense dark. It was the reason they lasted. The 18th truth. Meaning was not found, it was made. In the face of a life that could seem brutal, short, and meaningless, people wove stories. They found purpose in the protection of their family, in the solidarity of their community, in the simple, defiant act of getting through another winter. Their legacy was not in monuments, but in the sparks they nurtured and passed on, the skills, the stories, and the love. It was a legacy of embers, not of bonfires, but it was enough. It had to be. And as Alara looked at the fire, truly looked at it, she saw it not just as a source of heat, but as a living symbol of everything they were. Flickering, fragile, perpetually on the edge of extinction, yet stubbornly, beautifully alive. The night outside was still dark, and the world was still cold. But inside, for now, the spark held. Chapter 5. The weight of a footprint, the world began to soften. A green fuzz appeared on the branches of the willow trees by the stream. The first, Brave snowdrops pushed through the iron-hard earth in sheltered spots. The air lost its killing edge, carrying instead the rich, promising scent of wet soil and things waking up. The rhythm of life in Oak Haven began to change. The focus turned from survival to preparation. The great back-breaking work of the planting season was upon them. The strips in the common field needed to be turned, a task done with oxen and a heavy plow that required the men of the village to work together. The women began to sort through the saved seed grain, their fingers moving with a practiced urgency. Alara's world expanded again, from the confines of the cottage back out to the land. A body, which had grown accustomed to the lesser chores of winter, ached with the new demands. Her hands, softened by the indoor work, became raw and blistered from handling hoe and rake. But there was a different quality to this ache. It was not the passive ache of enduring the cold, but the active ache of creation. It was the pain of turning the soil, of planting the seed, of inviting the future. It was filled with a fragile, terrifying hope. This was the 19th truth. Hope was a dangerous, necessary gamble. After a winter of scarcity, you were forced to take your most precious resource, the seed grain that could have been ground into flour and eaten and buried in the ground. You were betting it against the weather, against blight, against drought. You were investing in a future you had no guarantee of seeing. It was an act of profound faith. One evening, as Alara was weeding their small garden plot, her fingers digging in the cool earth, she found something. It was a piece of pottery turned up by her trowel. It was small, curved, glazed a deep green with a faint, ghostly pattern of lines. It was unlike any pot she had ever seen in Oak Haven. It was finer, older. She cleaned it in the rainwater barrel, rubbing the caked dirt away. The pattern emerged more clearly, interlocking lines like waves or woven branches. It was beautiful. Who had made it? How old was it? How had it come to be here, in their garden? She showed it to her father. He turned it over in his rough hands, his brow furrowed. "Old," he grunted. "From before my grandfather's time, maybe." He handed it back, his interest fleeting. It was a curiosity, nothing more. It had no use, but to Alara, it was a marvel. That night, by the fire, she held it, tracing the pattern with her thumb. It was a message. A whisper from someone else who had lived here, who had dug in this same earth, who had perhaps wondered about those who came before them. They were gone, completely. No one knew their name, their story, what they had hoped for or feared. All that was left of them was this small, broken piece of clay. The 20th truth. Your insignificance was absolute. You lived, you worked, you loved, and you died. And within a generation or two, you would be utterly forgotten. The world would not remember you. History was written about kings and bishops, not about the woman who spun the wool or the man who plowed the field. You were part of the vast, anonymous multitude upon whose backs the world was built, and your passing would leave no more mark than a footprint on a muddy path, washed away by the next rain. It was a devastating thought. A profound loneliness threatened to swallow her. What was the point of all the struggle, the fear, the relentless labor, if it all ended in nothingness? If her life was as fleeting and forgotten as last year's leaves? She looked at her family. Her father, mending a harness. Her mother, spinning. Finn, now recovered, playing with a stick on the floor. They were her world. And their world was this village, these fields, these stories. They would never see a city, never read a book, and never know what lay beyond the forest. Their horizons were bounded by the hill and the river. This was the final, and perhaps most difficult, truth to face. The narrowness of a life, the sheer limitation of experience. You were born, you lived, and you died within a few square miles. The sum total of your experiences would be the turning of the seasons, the demands of your lord, the love of your family, and the constant grinding work to stay alive. There was no travel, no education, and no chance to find yourself or explore your potential. Your potential was to be a good laborer, a good spouse, a survivor. For a moment, the weight of it was unbearable. The walls of the cottage felt like the walls of a tomb. The future stretched out before her, an endless repetition of dawns and chores and hunger and cold. She closed her hand around the piece of pottery, its edges pressing into her palm. She thought of the person who made it. They were gone, but this remained. It was not a grand monument, but it was a testament. They had existed. They had created something of beauty. And then she looked around again, but with new eyes. She saw her mother's hands, moving with infinite skill as she spun the wool into a strong, even thread. That thread would become cloth, which would clothe their family. It was a creation. She saw her father's knowledge, the way he could read the soil and the sky. That knowledge would feed them. It was a legacy. She heard the story her mother had told of the first fire. That story would be told to Finn's children and theirs. It was a spark passed on. They would not be remembered by name, but the things they made, the knowledge they held, the love they shared, these were the waves that rippled outwards through time. The green pot was a wave from a distant shore. Her mother's spinning was a wave that would touch a future she would never see. Her life was not meaningless because it was small. Its meaning was concentrated, like a flame focused by a lens. It was found in the warmth of the hearth on a cold night, in the taste of a shared stew, in the feeling of the sun on her face after a long winter, in the simple, profound act of planting a seed in the dark earth, trusting in a spring you might not live to see. It was a different kind of immortality, not one of fame, but of continuity. She was a link in a chain that stretched back to the person who made the pot, and forward to people she would never know. Her duty was not to be remembered, but to be a good link, to strengthen the chain, to protect the spark and pass it on. The sense of suffocating limitation began to ease. It did not disappear, but it transformed. The boundaries of her life were not the walls of a prison, but the walls of a home. Within them was everything that truly mattered. The vast, anonymous world of kings and history could not offer anything more valuable than what she already had right here. A place by the fire, a people to belong to, a purpose, however humble. She put the piece of pottery on the small shelf near the hearth. It was a reminder. not of her insignificance, but of her connection. She was a part of the long, unbroken story of this place. The next morning, she went to the field with her father. The earth was dark and rich. She took a handful of seed grain from the sack and cast it onto the freshly turned soil with a sweeping motion her father had taught her. It was an act of faith, a prayer, a defiance. Her footprints sank into the soft earth. Tomorrow's rain would wash it away, but the seed she had sown would take root. And in that was everything. Chapter 6. The turning of the wheel. The world turned from the cool, fresh green of spring into the heavy, humid blanket of summer. The sun, once a welcome friend, became a demanding master, burning from a white-hot sky. The air in the cottage was thick and still, smelling of dried herbs, warm earth, and the sweat of honest labor. The days were now defined by the sun's arc, longer than any Ilara could remember. They began at first light and ended when the light finally bled from the sky, a slow, honeyed twilight that seemed to go on forever. The work was different, but no less relentless. The delicate shoots in the field had become a sea of green, but between them, weeds thrived. Ilara spent her days bent double, moving down the rows of barley and wheat with a hoe, her back a constant knot of pain, the sun burning the part in her hair. This was the 21st truth, the tyranny of the sun. There was no escape from the elements. In winter, you fought the cold. In summer, you fought the heat. There was no air conditioning, no electric fan, and no chilled water from a refrigerator. You sought shade under a tree for a brief respite. You drank tepid water from the well, and you endured. Your body adapted, sweat becoming a second skin, a permanent sheen on your brow. But with the hardship came a burgeoning abundance that felt like a miracle after the lean months. The garden plot behind the cottage exploded with life. Peas swelled in their pods, onions stood tall and green, and the first tender beans appeared. Their meals transformed. The thin gray gruel was replaced by thick pottages studded with vegetables, and on rare occasions, a precious egg from their single hen. The act of eating became a small celebration, a direct, tangible reward for their labor. Ilara felt a connection to the land that was deeper than ownership. It was a partnership. She had helped plant the seed. She had weeded around it, and now she was helping to reap its bounty. This was the 22nd truth, the profound spiritual connection to the food you ate. You did not simply purchase sustenance from a sterile shelf. You knew the exact effort, the worry, the hope, and the sun that had gone into every mouthful. A simple boiled potato tasted of the earth and the rain and the ache in your back. It was a sacrament. One afternoon, a ripple of excitement passed through the village. The traveling priest had been spotted on the road. Father Clement was a rare and fleeting connection to the world beyond the forest, a representative of God whose vast, imposing church was a day's walk away in a place they had never seen. His arrival was an event. He was a thin, dusty man, his robes patched and faded, his face lined from the road. He did not stay in any one cottage, but held his service in the open air, near the old standing stone at the edge of the common field. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the villagers gathered. They stood not sad, their faces solemn and expectant. Father Clement's voice was reedy, but it carried in the still evening air. He spoke in Latin, a language of rolling, mysterious sounds that few of them understood beyond the familiar rhythms of the prayers. Pater Noster, quies in Sleepless. The words were a comfort not for their meaning, but for their ancient, ceremonial sound. They were a spell against chaos, a connection to something immense and orderly. This was the 23rd truth. Faith was a practical, tangible force. It was not a matter of private belief, but a communal ritual for protection and explanation. God and the saints were invoked for a good harvest, for healing, for protection from storms. The older, darker spirits of the forest and field were propitiated to ward off blight and misfortune. It was a dual insurance policy, covering all bases in an unpredictable world. You prayed to the Christian God in Latin, and you still placed the charm of rowan twigs over your door. There was no contradiction. It was all part of the same struggle to impose order on a chaotic universe. After the service, Father Clement moved among the people, offering blessings, listening to whispered confessions. He came to Alara's family, his eyes kind but distant. He placed a thin, dry hand on Finn's head, muttering a blessing. He looked at Alaric and Lyra. "The Lord's harvest looks bountiful this year," he said, his tone making it both an observation and a demand. Lyra nodded, her eyes downcast. "With God's grace, Father. We will remember the tithe." He nodded, satisfied, and moved on. The tithe, 1/10 of their harvest, would go to the church. Another extraction, another claim on their labor. But this one felt different, less immediately oppressive than the Lord's steward. It was a payment for spiritual security, for the hope of salvation in the next world, since this one offered so little. As night fell and the villagers dispersed back to their cottages, Alara watched Father Clement walk away down the darkening road, a solitary figure swallowed by the twilight. He was a bridge to a vast, unseen world of cathedrals and bishops and kingdoms, a world that felt as theoretical and distant as the stars beginning to prick the sky above. His visit was a reminder of their smallness, but also of their connection to a larger story, a cosmic drama of sin and redemption that gave a framework to their suffering. The summer wore on, the heat building towards the climax of the harvest. The atmosphere in Oak Haven became tense, focused. All other work ceased. The entire village, every man, woman, and child able to swing a sickle or bind a sheaf, would be called to the fields. The success or failure of the next week would determine the course of their entire year. The day before the harvest began, there was a festival. It was a small, quiet affair, but a festival nonetheless. A sheep was slaughtered on the common ground, and the air was filled with the smell of roasting meat, a rich, fatty, glorious smell that made everyone's mouth water. There was a cask of weak, sour ale brought up from the manor. For a few hours, the relentless pressure lifted. There was laughter, the sound of a pipe being played, and even some clumsy dancing. Alara watched it all, a cup of the tart ale in her hand. She saw her parents talking with Goodrich and Agnes. Their faces relaxed for once. She saw Finn running with the other children, a rare moment of unburdened joy. She felt a sense of belonging, of being a single thread in the tight woven fabric of this community. This was the 24th truth. Joy was not a constant state, but a fleeting, precious island in a river of toil. It was seized in the moment, a festival, a shared meal, a story well told, a warm evening. It was not taken for granted. It was recognized for the rare gift it was, and cherished all the more fiercely because of its brevity. Happiness was a verb, an action you took by coming together, by sharing, by momentarily forgetting the weight of the world. That night, as she lay waiting for sleep, the sounds of the festival having died away, Alara thought about the turning of the wheel. The seasons did not ask for permission. They simply turned. Winter would come again, with its cold and its hunger. But now, she understood the rhythm. The intense labor of spring planting, the hopeful growth of summer, the frantic, back-breaking effort of the harvest, and the long, slow draw of winter. It was a cycle. It was relentless, but it was predictable. There was a comfort in that predictability. You knew what was coming. You knew what was required of you. Her life would be this. The turning of the wheel, again and again. The same struggles, the same fears, the same small joys. It was a life of repetition, of cycles. But within that repetition, she now saw a pattern, a purpose. Her role was to keep the wheel turning, to plant the seed, to reap the harvest, to tend the fire, to tell the stories, to be a good link in the chain. It was not a small life. It was a necessary one. She was a keeper of the spark. And as she finally drifted into sleep, she felt not the oppressive weight of her destiny, but a quiet, steady sense of place. The wheel would turn, and she would turn with it, doing her part. And that was enough. Final chapter. The echo of the spark. The harvest was a blur of motion and sensation. A golden haze of chaff hung in the air, catching the light. The sound of sickles swishing through grain was the music of those days, rhythmic and urgent. The feel of the rough stalks against her hands, the weight of the sheaves as she bound them, the constant, dull ache in every muscle. It was a kind of fever dream of labor. Alara worked alongside her mother and the other women, her movements becoming automatic. Cut, gather, bind, and stack. Cut, gather, bind, and stack. The sun beat down, but a sense of collective purpose kept them moving. The men followed with the carts, hauling the bundled sheaves to the barns. Even Finn helped, following behind to glean any stray ears of grain that had been missed. It was over in a week. The fields, once a waving sea of gold, were reduced to stubble. The barns were full. A collective sigh of relief passed through Oak Haven. The most dangerous part was over. The grain was cut. It was stored. They had food. They would survive the winter. But the work was not done. The grain had to be threshed, beaten from the husks, and winnowed, tossed in the air so the wind could blow the chaff away. It was work for the shorter, colder days to come. For now, there was a palpable sense of accomplishment. They had faced the elements, the pests, the uncertainty, and they had won. This year, at least. The air changed. There was a new crispness in the mornings, a sharpness to the shadows that had not been there before. The leaves on the oak trees at the forest edge began to tinge with gold and russet. The wheel was turning again. One evening, Alara walked to the well alone. The sky was a deep, clear violet, the first stars beginning to show. The harvest moon, huge and orange, was rising over the hill. It was a sight of such breathtaking beauty that had stopped her in her tracks. The world was silent, bathed in that strange, ethereal light. She stood there for a long time, just breathing it in. The ache in her body, the worries about the winter, the memory of Finn's sickness, the fear of the Wolf, it all fell away. In this moment, there was only the moon, the cool air on her skin, and the profound, majestic silence. This was the 25th, and perhaps most important, truth, the capacity for awe. In a life stripped of distraction, the beauty of the natural world was not a backdrop. It was a profound experience. A perfect sunset after a day of rain, the first snowfall, the taste of a wild strawberry, the overwhelming scent of lime trees in bloom. These were not minor pleasures. They were gifts. They were moments of pure, unadulterated joy that could make the heart ache with their intensity. You did not scroll past them on a screen. You stopped. You absorbed them. They sustained the spirit in ways that full bellies and warm fires could not. She returned to the cottage, her soul feeling quiet and full. Her family was already gathered around the hearth. The fire was banked for the night, a deep red glow. Her mother was not spinning. Her father was not mending. They were simply sitting, watching the embers. Finn was already asleep. Alara took her place beside them. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft crackle of the dying fire and the slow, regular breathing of her family. She looked at her parents' faces in the dim, pulsing light. She saw the lines etched by sun and worry, the weariness in their eyes, the strength in their hands resting on their knees. They had lived this life, this hard, narrow, beautiful life. They had endured its winters and celebrated its harvests. They had known fear and love and loss. And they were still here. They had passed the spark to her. She thought of the piece of green pottery on the shelf. A message from the past. She thought of the stories her mother told. A message for the future. She was the connection between them. Her life, her body, her spirit was the vessel that carried it all. She would likely never travel beyond the forest. She would marry someone from a nearby village, perhaps. She would have children. She would work the land, tend the fire, and face the endless cycle of seasons until her body could no longer do it. She would be forgotten. But as she sat in the quiet, watching the embers breathe their lost light, she knew that it mattered. Her love for her family mattered. Her skill with a home mattered. The way she could make Finn laugh mattered. The memory of the harvest moon on her face mattered. It was a small life, but it was her life. It was real. It was felt deeply. The world of kings and bishops, of cathedrals and history books, would roll on without noticing her passing. But the world of Oak Haven would notice. Her family would notice. The chain would be weaker for her absence. The spark would flicker. The great, overwhelming lesson of this age was not about strength or weakness. It was about value. We measure value in achievements, in wealth, in legacy. They found value in presence, in being there, in doing your part, in keeping the wheel turning, in nurturing the spark, however small, against the immense and waiting dark. Their lives were a testament to a different kind of success, endurance, persistence, the quiet, monumental courage of getting up every dawn and facing the day, again and again, for a lifetime. It is a courage so profound we have almost lost the ability to see it. The fire embers collapsed in on themselves with a soft sigh, sending up a final shower of orange sparks that winked out before they reached the roof. The cottage was plunged into a darkness so complete it was like being underwater. Alara listened to the breathing of her family. She felt the familiar press of the night, the vast, ancient silence of the world outside their thin walls. But she was not afraid. She carried a spark inside her now, a spark made of memory, of knowledge, of love. It was a small light, but it was hers, and it was enough. Calm closure, the whisper in the night. And so we leave them there, in the darkness, listening to the turning of the world. Their story has no end, for it is the story of humanity itself, a story of struggle and hope, of community and solitude, of finding light in the deepest dark. The title of our tale was Why You Wouldn't Last a Day in Medieval Times, but perhaps a truer title would be Why Their Day Lasts Forever in Us, for we are their legacy. Our comfort was bought with their hardship. Our certainty was built upon their uncertainty. We are the future they planted seeds for, even though they knew they would never sit in our shade. We carry their spark within us, their resilience, their capacity for wonder in a simple moonrise, their understanding that true wealth is found in the people around your hearth. So the next time you flip a switch and light floods a room, think of the flint and the tinder. When you open a full refrigerator, think of the hungry gap. When you feel lonely in a crowd, think of the profound solidarity of a shared goose fat poultice. And when you worry your life is too small, remember Ilara. Remember that a life is not measured by its geographic scope or its historical footprint, but by its depth of feeling and its strength of love. Their world is gone, but its echoes are all around us if we know how to listen. In the end, they were not so different from us. They just loved and feared and hoped under a much darker, much quieter sky. And so the night falls quiet, carrying their whispers into silence. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss another whisper in the night. Until we meet again, good night.